Lyra Voss had learned long ago that the safest place for a girl like her was the shadows. For 3 years, she had worked as the lowest-ranking maid in the palace of King Draven Ashcombe, sweeping floors before dawn and mending linens after dark, always careful to stay unseen. She wore a plain patch on her wrist every morning, hidden beneath her sleeve, to keep her true nature masked from the sharp noses of the palace guards. No one could know she was an Omega. Omegas born outside the royal registry were watched closely, sometimes taken away for reasons no one explained. So Lyra kept her head down and her secrets closer. She also kept another secret, one she barely understood herself. Almost every night, the same dream returned to her. She saw a nursery filled with orange light, smoke curling along the ceiling, and a woman's voice, soft but urgent, telling her to run and never look back. She never saw the woman's face. She only remembered the warmth of being carried, and then cold night air, and then nothing. She had always assumed it was just a dream, a strange leftover from a fever she must have had as a child. She never imagined it was a memory. The palace itself was a place of quiet tension that autumn. The harvest accord was approaching, a yearly gathering where nobles from 3 neighboring kingdoms came together under King Draven's roof to renew old treaties and settle new disputes. The king was known across the land as a fierce and unshakable alpha, a soldier before he was ever a king, more comfortable with a sword in his hand than a crown on his head. Servants whispered that he never smiled, that his eyes were as cold as winter stone. Lyra had passed him in the halls perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, and each time she had simply lowered her gaze and stepped aside, the way she was trained to do. On the night of the accord, the palace was alive with candlelight and music. Nobles filled the great hall in silks and jewels, and the kitchens overflowed with trays of food that needed carrying. Lyra had been assigned to the servants' corridor just outside the private council chamber, a narrow hallway meant only for staff, where she was to wait in case any of the meeting's attendants needed refreshments brought in quietly. It was there, in that dim hallway, that she heard something that did not belong. A faint metallic click, followed by the soft creak of a bowstring being drawn tight. She had grown up in a village where hunters passed through often, and she knew the sound of a crossbow being loaded when she heard it. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She turned toward the sound, just as the council chamber door opened, and King Draven stepped out alone, his mind clearly elsewhere, already reaching for a folded letter in his coat. There was no time to shout a warning. Lyra did not remember deciding to move. Her body simply acted before her thoughts could catch up, throwing itself forward, placing her between the king and the dark corner where the bolt was released. She felt the impact a heartbeat later, a burning, tearing pain in her shoulder that dropped her to her knees. The hallway erupted into chaos. Guards came running from both directions, boots pounding against stone. One assassin was caught before he could escape through a side door, wrestled to the ground by 2 guards while he cursed and struggled. 2 others vanished into the darkness of the servants' stairwell, moving too quickly to be caught in the confusion. King Draven knelt beside Lyra, his cold composure cracking for the first time that anyone could remember. He pressed his hand against her wound to slow the bleeding, his voice sharp as he called for the physician. When one of the guards moved to carry her, Draven waved him off and lifted her himself, cradling her against his chest as though she weighed nothing at all. It was an act so unlike him that the guards exchanged uneasy glances behind his back. Kings did not carry maids, but that night he did. The physician's chamber was small and lit by a single lantern, its walls lined with old medical instruments and dried herbs hanging from the beams. The physician, an elderly man named Aldrich, who had served the royal family for decades, worked quickly to clean and stitch the wound in Lyra's shoulder. She was pale and shaking, more from shock than pain, and she barely noticed when a few drops of her blood fell from the edge of the table onto a small engraved plate set into its surface. The plate was old, worn smooth by centuries of use, and etched into it was the Ashcombe family sigil, a crescent moon wrapped in laurel leaves. It was, Aldrich later explained, no ordinary decoration. It had been placed on that table generations ago by a royal enchanter, designed to react only to blood carrying the true Ashcombe bloodline, a safeguard once used to confirm the identity of royal heirs when parentage was in question. The moment Lyra's blood touched it, The crescent moon began to glow with a soft golden light. The room fell utterly silent. Aldrich stared at the sigil, then at Lyra, then back again, his hands frozen mid-motion. King Draven, who had been pacing near the door, stopped completely. Aldrich's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. He said the sigil had not reacted like that in over 20 years, not since the night the king's infant sister was believed to have died in a fire that swept through the Old East nursery. Draven's expression hardened immediately. He said it was impossible, that his sister had died as a baby, that everyone knew the story. But Aldrich was already reaching for Lyra's collar, gently pulling it aside, to reveal a small birthmark on her collarbone, a pale crescent shape that Lyra had always had and never thought twice about. Aldrich's hands trembled as he pointed to it. It was, he said quietly, identical to the mark every true-born Ashcombe carried since the family's founding. Lyra felt the room tilt around her, though she could not tell if it was from blood loss or the sheer impossibility of what she was hearing. She wanted to laugh it off, to say there had to be some mistake, that she was simply a village girl who had come to the city years ago looking for work. But even as she opened her mouth to object, the dream returned to her with sudden, painful clarity. The burning nursery, the woman's voice telling her to run, the cold night air. It had never been a dream at all. It had been the last night of her old life. Pieces began falling into place with dizzying speed. She remembered, faintly, being raised in a distant village by a woman she had always called Aunt Mara, a quiet, watchful woman who died when Lyra was 12, leaving her alone with nothing but a small trunk of old clothes, and no explanation of where she had truly come from. Lyra had always assumed she was simply an orphan. Now she understood that Aunt Mara had likely been the very nurse who carried her from the burning nursery that night, sacrificing her own comfort and safety to protect a child who was never supposed to have survived. Draven sat down slowly, as though the strength had gone out of his legs. He had grown up believing his baby sister died in that fire, a tragedy that had shaped much of his cold, guarded nature ever since. To learn she might be alive, sitting in front of him with a fresh wound from saving his own life, was almost too much to hold in his mind at once. But there was little time to sit with the shock. If Lyra truly was the missing princess, then someone had worked very hard for 20 years to make sure the world believed otherwise, and that same someone, Draven realized with a cold, sinking feeling, might be the one behind the assassins in the corridor that very night. His thoughts turned immediately to his uncle, Regent Corwin, who had ruled beside him as an advisor since Draven took the throne young, following their father's death. Corwin had always positioned himself as the loyal protector of the family, the steady hand guiding a young king through difficult years. But Draven remembered, now that he searched his memory carefully, that Corwin had been unusually insistent that the East Wing be rebuilt and its old records destroyed after the fire, claiming it was too painful a reminder to keep. At the time, grieving and young, Draven had agreed without question. Aldrich confirmed what Draven feared. He had served in the palace long enough to remember whispers from the night of the fire, servants who claimed the flames started strangely, in a room with no fireplace, no candles left unattended. Those servants had been quietly dismissed from service within a month, and never spoken of again. If Corwin had arranged the fire to remove a rival claim to the throne, then discovering that the child had survived, and now stood in the palace with royal blood confirmed before witnesses, would be the single greatest threat to everything he had built in the years since. Word could not be allowed to spread carelessly. Draven ordered the guards to keep the wounded assassin isolated and questioned quietly, away from Corwin's influence, while Aldrich tended to Lyra through the rest of the night. Lyra, exhausted and overwhelmed, drifted in and out of sleep, her dreams no longer frightening, but strangely peaceful, filled with the sense that some old, aching part of her had finally been given an answer. By morning, however, it became clear that secrecy would not hold for long. A guard loyal to Corwin had overheard enough of the physician's frantic report to carry word to the regent before dawn. When Draven learned that Corwin had already begun quietly gathering men near the palace's western gate, he understood that waiting any longer would only give his uncle time to silence Lyra permanently and destroy the truth along with her. Draven made his decision swiftly. Rather than hide his sister away for safety, he chose to bring her forward, into the light. before the very nobles gathered for the harvest accord. A hidden princess could be hunted in the shadows. A princess revealed before witnesses, blood confirmed by the ancient sigil and supported by the palace's own physician, would be far harder to erase. That evening, though her shoulder still ached beneath fresh bandages, Lyra stood beside King Draven in the great hall as the assembled lords quieted at his request. She wore a simple gown, nothing like the elaborate silks of the nobility around her, and she gripped her brother's arm more for courage than support. Draven addressed the hall with a steadiness that surprised even himself, explaining what the sigil had revealed, presenting the crescent birthmark, and naming Lyra as his sister, the princess long believed lost. A ripple of disbelief moved through the crowd, followed by a heavier, more dangerous silence, as eyes turned toward Regent Corwin, who stood near the back of the hall. For a moment, his face remained perfectly composed, the same calm mask he had worn for 20 years. But when Draven met his gaze directly and asked, in front of every noble present, why he had insisted the East Wing records be destroyed so quickly after the fire, something in Corwin's expression finally cracked. He did not confess outright. He did not need to. His hesitation, the flicker of panic behind his eyes, the way his hand tightened around his goblet, told the room everything his silence could not hide. Whispers spread rapidly through the hall. Nobles who had always found Corwin's ambition slightly too polished, now recalling old suspicions they had never dared voice aloud. Within moments, Draven ordered the guards forward, and Corwin was taken from the hall under formal charge of treason, his protests swallowed by the growing murmur of the crowd. The days that followed were a blur for Lyra. She was moved from the servants' quarters to rooms in the royal wing she had once only dusted from the doorway. Her title changed overnight from Maid to Princess Leora Ashcombe. It felt, for a while, like wearing clothes that belonged to someone else, too large and unfamiliar for her shoulders. She missed the simplicity of her old life, even as she marveled at the strange new one unfolding around her. Draven, for his part, changed as well, though more slowly and quietly. The guarded coldness he had carried since childhood began to soften in small ways, most visible only to those who had known him longest. He began seeking Lyra out in the evenings, not out of duty, but because he found he genuinely wanted to know her, to hear about the small village where she had grown up, the games she had played as a child, the meals Aunt Mara used to cook. In turn, Lyra found herself slowly letting go of the instinct to stay small and unseen, learning instead what it meant to take up space in a life that was truly her own. On the night the Harvest Accord fires were finally lit in celebration, delayed by nearly a week due to everything that had happened, Lyra stood beside her brother on the palace balcony, watching the flames rise below in the courtyard. She admitted quietly that she had never wanted a crown, had never dreamed of palaces or titles, only of understanding where she came from, and why she had always felt like a piece was missing. Draven, watching the fire's glow reflect in his sister's eyes, told her gently that she did not need to want the crown to keep it. What mattered, he said, was that she had already found something far more important than a title. She had found her family, and it had found her back. Below them, the fires burned bright against the night sky, and for the first time in 20 years, the Ashcombe family stood whole again, no longer divided by secrets or shadows, but bound instead by the truth that had finally, painfully, beautifully come to light.